All right, so those of you who have been in one of the classes we've had the last couple days that we were working on defense, what are the four main defensive kinds of defense in boxing?
Moving your feet.
All right, so we've got footwork. Good. What else?
Slips and
Yep, so slips, rolls. Right, so that's head movement. Good. What's next? Parries. Excellent. And what's the last one? Blocks. Shit, look at you guys remembering this. All right, so another thing that you might notice, these are not only in order of efficiency, they are also in order of range. So that little drill that we did there, that was just kind of getting you acclimated and thinking in that dimension, right? And that's the linear space between yourself and your opponent, and more importantly, whether or not you can actually engage each other. So we've got footwork, which is the longest range activity. Now, what can you do with your feet to be defensive? All right, increase range. What else can you do?
go side to side with the back.
Change your line, come off line. Good. What else was you saying?
Go side to side.
Yep, so linear or lateral movement rather. What else?
You can go up and down.
You can go up and down. I'd say that's kind of slips and rolls, but you know what? I'll take that either way because you still use your feet for that. All right, good. So good footwork, moving yourself out of position, basically is what that all comes down to, right? So we're gonna take these and we're gonna apply them to this concept here, which is defense in depth. Now that consists of two separate things: successive defensive actions and concurrent defensive actions. What's the difference?
One is one after the other, and one's at the same.
Exactly. All right, so successive defensive actions are when you use one to the next. So you use footwork to put yourself in position when you want to be there. You slip in your roll. You can make the argument that you're using passive defense, passive head movement. You're just moving your head slightly offline while you're coming in. You're going to use parries when you get into position and you start throwing punches and they start throwing back. And then if you get anything that comes at you that you're not expecting, you have your last resort is to use the block, right? That's successive. Now, concurrent defensive actions would be to come in using footwork that is inherently defensive while you're offending. So what would you do to do that? Give me an example of that. All right, closing range, but what can you do to make closing range more protective of you while you're doing it? Yep, all right, yep. Provide yourself covered concealment, but what else? There's something specific. Exactly, right? So you augment your linear distance when you're closing your range with angles, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to come off away from the bag. We're going to close with a 1-1 or a 1-1-2. And then I want you to come offline either to the left or the right, whichever one's more comfortable for you. And I want you to throw 3 punches. I don't care what 3 punches. Just make sure that they are useful, or you can throw them well based off of which direction you move. Does that make sense? Make them synergistic. Any questions about that? No. All right. Give it a try. I'll come by and look. So what that exercise did was it just kind of gave you a little bit of an idea of closing the distance, coming offline, and doing that to throw a combination. So I put some examples up here that should be helpful, right? So successive defensive actions would be you're doing good footwork, closing the range, doing whatever, and then bobbing when you get there, right? So you get into position, you throw out a bob and weave because they're probably trying to engage with you, and if you can't engage first, then by all means be defensive and then engage. Then you have slipping, then parrying. So let's say you slip, and then they throw another punch, bang, you parry. All right, beautiful. And then we've got jabbing, then catching, because the jab, like any offensive action, is also inherently defensive, right? And that's how it should be. There is this paradoxical relationship between offense and defense, where all offense is inherently defensive, but you have to be deliberately defensive while you're offensive. If that blows your mind, we'll talk about that a little bit later, right? And then concurrent defensive actions, we've got keeping your head offline like when you throw your straight. So instead of throwing your straight and keeping your chin right on your center line, you pull it off. Now notice how I'm not bringing my weight over here. I'm squatting down, but my shoulder is replacing the spot where my head is. Remember, if you make a miss by an inch, you make a miss by a mile. When people try to artificially add additional head movement to their punches, a lot of times they wind up exposing themselves more than necessary, or they throw themselves off balance, especially when it comes to people trying to throw big right hands because they don't really understand the mechanics of what a right hand is supposed to do and what it's supposed to look like. And so you'll see guys do this, and then their head comes past their lead knee. Now they're off balance, and if they were to get countered while they were doing that, good counterpuncher could definitely get past those big wide right hands. They're going to get hit with a hook and they're going to fall over, or at least they're going to look like they're going to fall over because they're going to get hit and lose their balance. All right, so concurrent defensive actions, head offline during the straight, offline footwork while slipping. So if you're going to slip, and I like to slip and counter to the body while moving to the right because it sets up a right hand. And it's a right hand that the other guy's going to be he's going to be trying to attempt that too. So if you're faster, you see his jab coming, you slip out, you throw that body shot, immediately stand up and throw a cross. Because you have that step, like that quarter step that comes forward at like a 45-degree angle, you've closed the range. You've also concurrently pulled your head offline from where his straight would go. And because you're on the outside of his lead foot, his straight's going to be coming off of his center line anyway, so you've reduced the power. So there's a significantly lessened threat there. And most people don't understand that because they don't know how these things work. And so you'll see people just trying to argue about the dumbest things. All right. Sorry, that's my personal grievance of the day. All right. And there's many more to come, I'm sure. And then the last one, hands up while you're slipping, right? You want to have two concurrent defensive actions? There's a perfect one. You'll see all these idiots trying to slip like this. And it's, why? Does it look fancy? Sure. Until it doesn't work. And then when you're on the ground and your opponent's looking down at you like, I can't believe you just ate that shot. Well, it's because you were being stupid. So, that in a very general and quick sense is successive defensive actions and concurrent defensive actions. All of these things lend themselves to defense in depth. So the next principle we're going to do is managing transitions. So a lot of times people get offense very good, or they have very good defense, but they cannot go back and forth between the two. So the best thing to do, in an ideal world, all of your defense would be inherently offensive, but that's just not how it works. So there is a transition that has to be managed. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get on the bag, we're going to throw an offensive combination, and then we're going to do a defensive action while continuing to offend. All right, so if you have never done anything like this before, we're going to start with a very basic and easy way to do it. We're going to throw 1, 2, 7, and we're going to step to the strong side while we throw the 7. We're going to stand up, and then we're going to throw a cross. So what that's doing, you throw the 1, 2, right? That's setting up the 7. You throw the 7, you have to squat. You're going to squat and roll while you're throwing that 7. Bang. Then when this foot gets back into position, you're going to throw that cross. If you know how to do an offensive, defensive transition, then you can do whatever combination you want. But if you don't, then just do 1, 2, 7, 4. All right? All right, give it a try. All right, so keys to transition management. So I came by and I watched everybody do that combination, which was a simple but very useful example of having an offensive defense and a defensive offense. And that brings us to the first principle, key to transition, overlap. The more that your offense and defense have in character or like have in sync. So the more defensive your offense and the more offensive your defense, the less actual transition you have to do. So if your hands are always up, your feet and your head are always moving, and you always are sticking something in the face of your opponent, well, now your offense and your defense don't look very different. So now it's a smaller amplitude of change between being offensive and offending or being defensive and defending. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So, number 2, immediate transition timing. So if you are forced by the circumstances of your engagement with your opponent that you have to be purely defensive or purely offensive, you have to be able to make that transition quickly. And the best thing to do is to keep the tools necessary for that transition open at all time. What do you think the fastest reactive organ that you have in offense or defense is on your body?
Your brain.
Your brain, okay, but what is the sensory organ? Eyes, exactly. So when you see people that shell up like this, and they are covering their eyes so they can't see, there's people that fight effectively out of that, sure. But there's also a lot of fighters that don't fight effectively out of that. So I always tell people, if you're really not worried about the straight shots of your opponent, which most of the time you're really not worried about the jab and the straight is easier to evade, you keep the hands back so that the eyes are open, because a very small deviation off of the center line can effectively reduce the damage that your opponent can apply to you. So being able to see and being able to defend against the harder, more devastating shots is you're incurring a small degree of risk to help enable you to be able to transition faster from defense to offense. And the other thing is you shouldn't just be sitting there shelled up moving your head. You should move your head once or twice and then fire back once or twice. Move your head once or twice, fire back once or twice, while you're trying to think about what you need to do or where you want to go so that you can start getting there. Does that make sense? All right. Number 3, variations in approach. Don't always transition from offense to defense or defense to offense the same way. So what does that mean? Don't always throw a 1-2 slip 2. Don't always throw a 1-2 catch 2, right? If you do that, you're doing an offensive action with a defensive component and then going back into an offensive action. But if you do that same thing more than 2 or 3 times, what's going to happen? Your opponent's going to figure it out. And then they're just going to be like, okay, they're not going to throw, they're just going to wait for you to throw your 1-2. And then as soon as you slip, they're going to counter with something unexpected. Or they're going to interrupt your 1-2 and then have something for when you try to slip, right? So, and we've talked about this before. When's the best time to counter? Well, it depends on what your objective is. You know what? We should save that for another time. Let's finish this. See, look, I stopped myself from going off on a tangent. All right. And then number 4, having a wide range of tools to help you transition. If you're good at blocking, if you're good at parrying, if you're good at slipping and rolling, and if you're good at footwork, guess what? Now you have all the necessary tools to be able to transition to offense to defense, defense to offense. When you have a deficiency, a marked deficiency in one of these categories, well, now you are lessening the available tools to help you manage those transitions. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to management. And again, one of my dictums, always dictate the terms of the engagement to your opponent, right? You decide when, where, and how you're going to be engaging each other. If you can do that, well, that's a huge element of managing the transition. And vice versa, if you manage your transitions from offense to defense, over time, you have thereby managed and dictated the terms of the engagement to your opponent. Does all that make sense? All right, so now what we're going to do is, we got 15 minutes left. All right, so we're going to hit the bag. You're going to give me a 3-punch combination, and you're going to change two elements of your approach. You could do range and angle, you could do range and level, you could do level, angle, whatever. You're going to give me a 3-punch combination where there's a change in there, and then I want you to back out. And I want you to back out under cover. So that means you're going to throw a 1-1 or a 1-2 or something while you come out, and and then I want you to come offline. 2 steps out, 1 step over, 2 steps out, 1 step over that way, or 1 step back, 2 steps out. Everybody know what that means? Okay. All right, let's give it a whirl. Let's go take a look at this. See what it looks like. Yep. All right, so one of the reasons that I do these drills for these, I don't know, we call them the fundamental classes, but honestly, this is really more the advanced class. We do advanced drilling, right? And the whole principle here, because I know some people are interested in pedagogy or in method, I present you an objective, right? I usually explain what the technique or the idea is that I want you to understand. I give you your tools. What were the tools for this drill? Well, let's go over what the drill we just did. What was the objective?
To change your approach.
Right, to manage the transition between offense and defense by having you just execute it, right? Like, because I just kind of told you what the overview was, and then I was like, all right, here, do this objectively offensive thing, throw some defense in it, and then be defensive in your egress, right? So the objective was manage the transition between offense, defense, or defensive offense to straight offense, and then to straight defense. The tools I gave you, what were the tools that I gave you?
Footwork, slips.
Yep. All right. So all those defensive capacities, and then how many punches were you supposed to throw in initial contact? 3. You had 3 punches. What were the constraints?
You had to have a slip.
Yep. You had to have a change in 2 of the dimensions, and then you had to have an egress that was both an increase in range and a change in angle. Good. All right. So that's kind of like the first half. So then the variations, we basically did that same drill 3 times today, right? Because what was the first thing I had you do? You remember? It was close range. It was close range, and then come offline and throw a combination that facilitated that offline movement, right? So we basically did the exact same thing, but in the inverse. Does that make sense? Right? So I gave you variations to achieve the same thing, and we approached it both forward-looking and looking in reverse. So we do these things, we have the discussion, and then we do the application and revision. We come by, I watch you execute the thing, I tell you what I see, and then if something needs to be fixed or if I want you to consider something else, we go over it. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
And, fundamentally, all this is designed to do is for me to give you the tools, the science, and for you to apply it artistically, right? The reason that Bach was arguably the best composer ever and really the inventor of modern Western music is because he had an understanding of the fundamentals better than anybody else. And he understood them so well that we basically canonized music because of his fundamental approach. That's what I'm trying to do here. If I give you the perfect fundamentally base understanding, then you can distort it or change it as necessary for you, which is how you turn the science into art, right? Because just any activity that we do as humans is a mixture of science and art. I give you the tools and the science, and then you create the art. Does that make sense? All right, now what we're going to do is we're just going to shadow box for the last 4 minutes. So find some space out there, and I want you to work on changing range, level, and angle, and I want you to think offensive defense and defensive offense and transition between the two. All right, go ahead, give it a whirl.